Hi, everyone. I'm Adrian Garcia, a Board IQ and Ignites reporter with Financial Times. On behalf of Cebu, welcome to today's training. We have a great panel on the line today, and they're ready to talk about how to cover environmental, social, and corporate governance topics. Rachel Cernansky is here to moderate today's discussion. Rachel is the sustainability editor for Vogue Business. She writes about the impacts of the apparel industry on everything from biodiversity to community-based development. Joining us as panelists today are Heather Clancy. Heather is the editorial director of GreenBiz, where she chronicles the role of technology in enabling corporate climate action and transitioning to a clean, inclusive, and regenerative economy. Also here is Leslie Kaufman. Leslie is a senior climate change reporter for Bloomberg Green, where she covers the people, politics, and science reshaping US climate policy. She writes frequently about the environmental justice movement, the financial and social implications of natural disasters, and the impacts of products like plastics and tobacco on the natural environment. Also here is Billy Nauman. Billy is a reporter and producer for Moral Money, the new digital platform and newsletter from the Financial Times. The new Moral Money features news and analysis about the fast expanding world of socially responsible businesses, sustainable finance, impact investing, and ESG trends. And rounding out the panel is Laura Weiss. Laura covers ESG issues and business in the US and authors CQ Roll Call's weekly ESG newsletter. Her beat covers the intersection of ESG factors such as climate change, diversity, and workplace safety with investments, business, public policy, and regulation. Before we jump in, one quick point of business for our listeners. If you have a question that comes up during the panel, please use the chat function on Zoom to submit it, and Rachel and the panel will get to it during the discussion. With that, I'll hand things over to Rachel and the panel. Rachel?
Thanks, Adrian. It's great to be here today. Before we start with questions, I think we're just going to go around and have everyone just introduce themselves and their work a little bit. So just going to go in the random order that Zoom has given me on my screen. So Leslie, can we start with you?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I'm Leslie Kaufman. I'm with Bloomberg Green. Bloomberg Green launched about a year ago. I think as someone who doesn't cover just ESG, I'm a person on this panel who covers a lot of things, not just ESG. I'm not going to be able to speak as much to the specifics of ESG, though I'm happy to weigh in when I have knowledge, but a little bit about the history and background, because I've covered this stuff for over a decade. I was a national climate reporter over at the New York Times a decade ago. And when we started covering climate, it really was a science story. It really fell into the science pages and people wanted to know, is this a real thing and how do you know it? That story has changed radically in the time I've covered it. When Bloomberg Green opened a year ago, it was an acknowledgement that this has very much become a business story, a story about how climate is going to impact our future. And that's going to be everything from our infrastructures to our homes, to our insurance, and of course, our money. And the things we're looking at, of course, are not just how it's going to impact those things, but where the flowing, how that will look in the future. So this, from our point of view, this is a very important business story. And Bloomberg Green looks at all the different aspects of that.
Thanks, Leslie. Heather, can you go next?
Sure, thanks. So GreenBiz is a business-to-business organization. Our readership, our audience is corporate sustainability professionals, including the companies themselves, the NGOs that interface with them, and activists that have something to do with sustainability plans and commenting on them. ESG for us has been really growing in importance over the last several years, largely because of the push from large institutional investors that have been really asking more questions about the topic and really, putting more pressure on the companies that they invest in to get their house in order and to talk more about this more. Like Leslie, I cover a lot of different things. In terms of sustainability, so I will speak generally, but I wanted to mention a couple of specific things that we've seen just in the past year. 2020 was really, I think, a pivotal point for this. The S part of it, the social part of the ESG concerns really came into the fore, for obvious reasons, human rights issues with supply chains, the racial justice movement. And also there was a sort of realization that in the past, people have thought that these investments weren't going to deliver good returns. And that really was disproven in the past year. So I think that it's those are two reasons why there's so much focus on this now. And there's three things that I'm sort of watching this year. One is like loans tied to these issues in terms of ESG concerns. I think there's also in terms of what you're thinking about to cover out there, new forms of divestment. It's not just oil companies now that are being pressured to get their house in order. We see companies talking about, you see investors asking companies to state their deforestation strategy. And finally, and this is really important for you all, how do people talk about this? Simplified reporting and how companies talk about this is a really big story this year, and I'm sure we'll delve into it much more deeply. And that's all I have to say right now.
Great. Thanks, Heather. Laura, let's go to you next.
Hi, thanks, Rachel. So I report on ESG and write a weekly ESG newsletter for CQ Roll Call. We're located in Washington, D.C., and CQ Roll Call's focus is federal politics and policy, but we also have a legal and business reporting team that brings insight into regulatory decision-making and sort of the nexus point between government and private sector activities. So that's where ESG really comes into what we do. I was a local reporter before I came to CQ Roll Call, joined in 2017 to cover corporate governance. And that was sort of what we were calling the beat at the time. That has evolved a lot very quickly. And now my beat specifically is ESG. We really saw it as increasingly becoming a top focus for companies and their investors, and also a significant policy area for regulators and lawmakers as well. And we really view ESG as one of, if not the biggest trend shaping business, and also a major trend with public policy and regulation right now. So my beat is pretty broad. I cover everything from climate change to workforce diversity to political spending to vaccination efforts, which is something I think that's really exciting about an ESG as a beat itself. It always comes back to sort of key themes of ESG, things like the role of business in society, the concept of risk and risk management, the relationship between company action and image, reputational risk, things like that. So it's a really exciting topic and beat in that it touches almost every public policy area, industry you could cover, jurisdiction, things like that. So I'm excited to talk more about ESG and answer some questions. Thanks for having me.
Great. And Billy, last but not least.
Yeah. Well, I don't really have anything different to say than everyone else, really. So very similar story. You know, we cover sort of the whole gamut of sustainability, impact investing, ESG. I think the Moral Money newsletter and platform, that's what we're calling it, kind of came out of the realization that the ESG was a really important story in the world of business, in the world of finance. My boss, Jillian Tett, came up with the idea that, just reading through the FT, a couple years ago, you would see how this stuff was really kind of coming up the agenda, right? But there was nowhere that really sort of pulled it all together. You would see in the coverage of energy companies how divestment pledges were impacting them potentially. You would see in the regulatory coverage how the EU was addressing green reporting. But what we wanted to do with Moral Money was pull all of that together and then expand upon it. And so we have a team of 3, including myself, and we try to cover it globally. We work with our partners at Nikkei, which owns the FT, and really try to keep up with the whole world and what's going on, because this really is a global story. But yeah, it's more than science, it's more than energy, it's everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, since it's everywhere and as it's growing, it seems like one of the biggest sort of challenges for journalists covering these beats is greenwashing. So I thought we could start there. How do you sort of defend against greenwashing or make sure that you're not sort of, doing companies, good reporting for them? Or so how do you navigate greenwashing claims in your reporting?
Is that for me? I'm happy to take it.
It's for the group, but
Okay.
Yeah. So Billy, let's start with you.
No, it's Anyway, well, I'll start. But I mean, it's just like any good reporting, right? Don't believe a word anyone tells you until you can verify it. I think if you're covering this stuff at all, or if you're covering any sort of business news, your inbox is probably full of companies making claims about what they're doing in terms of environmental improvement, social improvement, whatever it is. And I think it's really important to actually vet those claims. You don't want to reprint their press release because a lot of it is not, I don't know, it's not bad per se, but it's not what they make it out to be. I'm thinking of, banks. There was a big announcement from a bank earlier this week saying they're going net zero by 2050. You look at the actual announcement and there's nothing there. There's nothing in the announcement. It's just, we'll have a plan. I mean, first of all, 2050 is 30 years away. So it's really easy to say you're going to do something 30 years from now, but you really need to just actually go through what they're saying they're doing and see if it makes any sense. Talk to people who know, talk to scientists, talk to activists, talk to business people, financiers, whoever it may be, and really vet, what they're telling you. I mean, that's reporting 101, right?
Does anyone, I'd love to hear from other people on this question, and also adding to it, if anyone has specific tips on how you sort of juggle, we're all pressed for time. How do you do the background reporting to get the context so that you can sort of push back against claims? Like even in that case, like if there is a net zero pledge for 2050 and there is a plan, but if you don't report on this all the time and a lot of the plan is through offsets, how do you do the homework that will bring you to the point where you realize that that's maybe not the most credible plan? How do you do that, but also, make your deadline?
I'd be happy to weigh in on just this, which is that what we've found at Bloomberg is, and we cover this all the time, so maybe it's not the same as someone who doesn't cover it, but we've tried to come up with some standards for how we'll look at certain things. Are we going to include scope 1 emissions, scope 2 emissions, or scope 3 emissions? We've tried to create some standards. So when someone says they're going to be emission free by a certain time, we now have a set of questions that just help us understand how we're going to approach it. So we now look at scope 3 emissions for people who aren't familiar with that. That's not just the emissions you produce or your supply chain produces, it's all the emissions that come with your products. So we've started to ask some and just develop some basic questions so that when you're coming in, you know what you're looking at. We look very carefully at offsets. We look very carefully at when you're going to start implementing your plan. I mean, if you're saying you're going to be, even if you're going to be net zero by 2050, you should have something in place by 2025 or 2030. I mean, there should be a concrete step in the middle of there. So I do think it helps to just have the basics. Again, I'm not an expert on this in the way some of the other people on this panel, but we do have a series of benchmarks that just help us, anyone coming in. And we've started to spread this around the newsroom to other people who also don't cover it, but have their beats. And we want them to approach these things much more skeptically.
That's really interesting. Yeah, Heather, please.
Yeah, so I definitely, I think, and the whole offsets thing, I think it's that is an indicator right there. If it's mostly relying on offsets, then you can bet it's not necessarily as real as one would hope. So I think as a reporter, that tells you something. Also the sort of interim steps upon which someone will be reporting and will be meeting certain goals. Like there definitely has to be some road mapping in there. I also think, and I'll point to Nestle as an example here. I think it also, the money that a company is putting towards specific initiatives, for example, plant-based foods or some other initiative to point to that goal, I think is important. So when Nestle made their net zero announcement late last year, I think it was late last year. It's so blurring. There are so many of them, but it was recently. But they really talked specifically about where they were going to be investing money, when they were investing it, and they also committed to reporting it on their quarterly earnings discussions. So for me, that was like, wow, okay, that's pretty specific and pretty transparent, and putting the CEO on the hook, right? Putting the CEO and CFO on the hook for talking about it. So those were, to me, more credible. So it could be also who's talking about it and how they're going to talk about it would be an indicator.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Can I follow up to that point? I did
Yeah.
want to just say that I do think how a company says it will report in the future, and we don't have to get into integrated reporting, but I do think that that's an incredibly important part about whether you're going to be able to hold people to account in the future. So I just want to say that asking people, that's a good and important thing to be asking companies. How are you going to account for this going forward?
I'd like to build on something Heather said as well. I think looking at how much money they're actually dedicating to what they say they're doing is really important, but it's always important to go beyond the headline number they give you. See what percentage of OpEx, what percentage of CapEx are they actually dedicating to green projects or whatever it may be. This comes up with energy companies all the time where, oh, we're investing in this new algae technology or whatever it is. And it's like, less than a 0.1% of their annual OpEx or something like that. And they're trying to get all these headlines out of it. So really interrogate them. I'm always very skeptical of charitable donations. I think that those are incredibly hard to vet the efficacy of. And yeah, really interrogate the numbers, pull up the financials, pull up the, whatever tools you have at your disposal to see what it really actually means in the context of the full business.
Yeah. Okay. There's some stuff I want to follow up on, but Laura, I know you had something to say. So.
Oh yeah, I was just going to add on social risk as well. I think there's a really big thing going on right now, and something I've grappled with a lot in reporting with this whole concept of stakeholder capitalism now, and with the Business Roundtable statement in August 2019. It's become a big buzzword. It's become something that a lot of companies, especially big companies, want to say they're doing. And I think that's something that also, you have to bring that scrutiny to, and it is, difficult. But when you really dig into it, companies themselves will say, and the legal structure, in a lot of views, is that ultimately it all comes back to we're serving employees in service of shareholders. And I think that's an important distinction on some of the social risk discussions going on right now, and also is something where, like everyone was saying, do you have time-based metrics, transparency? Are you addressing the how? Are you talking about it in regulatory filings that are, enforceable disclosure, or just in press releases? And sort of the totality of what companies are doing, how they're lobbying while they're saying employees are a priority, how they're, spending. I think how they're spending their capital is a very good point as well. So, okay,
I'm curious if any of you, if there are certain topics that sort of have become like magnets where a lot of companies' funding is going, or where there's just a lot of attention that are leaving other needs unaddressed, and if you sort of have started to like just be more skeptical automatically, like just to sort of give a parallel, what I'm in the fashion industry, there's a ton of investment in like technology for sustainability, recycled, startups that are making recycled fibers and different things, but there is very little investment in just making agriculture better, regenerative agriculture for cotton, and helping farmers make these changes, or natural dye companies helping them scale, just like in the sort of natural world, but there's a lot of focus on tech. Are there, and so when I get, a press release from like a recycling company, it's just sort of like, it's just, I guess, maybe just a more jaded area at this point, even though it's still very new. Is there anything like that for you, where you sort of like, where there's just sort of not enough attention in certain areas because it's, because other things are in the spotlight?
Well,
too much, maybe?
I would say that, and this goes back to offsets, when you see lots and lots of offsets, what companies are not asking is, which of my products do I need to redesign, or maybe not, shouldn't exist at all? We ran a really great story on Disney, and all this money they were putting into the Amazon rainforest. Well, the reason they were doing that is because they were going to build a super huge cruise ship that was going to be able to launch like 10,000 more people. So when they're able to put all the attention on the rainforest, you might not be asking the basic question, which is whether the original product that it's there to offset and is still growing, whether they've really started to ask, maybe they should be designing their ships differently. And I think that that's where offsets are very dangerous.
Yeah.
I was going to say offsets too. That was the first thing that came to mind. And the Bloomberg did some really good work on offsets. I think 2 stories ran in December, one that she just mentioned and one on the Nature Conservancy and some of the groups selling these offsets. If anybody hasn't read those, I highly recommend them, not to drive you away from the FT, but Bloomberg did some really good work on those. And yeah, I mean, if anybody tells me, oh, we're just going to plant a bunch of trees, that sends off huge alarm bells, right? Like, offsets are not the answer. And they're often used as a way to distract from the fact that companies are not changing their business models. There are going to be industries in which it is very hard to abate their carbon emissions, and certainly planting trees is encouraged, but it is not a substitute for actually cutting your emissions. And a lot, yeah, that's one thing. Offsets are almost always a red flag for me.
I have so many on my list. It's hard to, but actually you just brought up one of them. One of the things that I've been really on about is the forest, the tree planting movement. And I respect it. And I'm glad that people are focused on that, but I'd like them to focus more on not cutting them down in the first place. And so agricultural companies have a big responsibility there. So that for me is sort of, I think there needs to be more of an attention on deforestation. So like, that's kind of the thing that doesn't get covered because the tree planting movement is being covered so much. I also, for me, one of the most hyped but also important stories is regenerative agriculture, because it touches that offsets movement that we were just talking about. The idea is put carbon in the soil instead of necessarily sucking it out of the air and with the technology. But there seem to be a lot of pilots and not a lot of real actual work happening there. It could become like the organic movement where it's like just a teeny little bit part of the land when it needs to be a whole lot of land. So those are 2 things.
Yeah.
I think another that comes to mind for me is with all the discussion around political spending since the insurrection on January 6th, a good number of those commitments to pause spending or suspend or restrict it have been specific to company PACs. And I think that has been like reported on and clear, but it is something where I think, that's far from the only way that companies are sending their dollars into politics, influencing politics. It is one of the ways that is more associated with their brand and their image. So it makes sense, but that, there's a lot more depth there to be explored. I think that they're trying to avoid some.
Yeah.
Actually, just to add something onto that, you want indicators for knowing if someone's greenwashing their net zero statement. Look where their lobbying money is going. And if they're not lobbying for some of the things that would help them get there, and they're not, and they're not speaking up about things that would prevent them from getting there, that's an indicator that they're not doing enough.
I would second that. And I would also add to it, look at how they are or not disclosing their lobbying behavior. You see a lot of companies where there are shareholder resolutions asking for them to give more information on how they're lobbying, and they fight tooth and nail to get those thrown off the ballot or to defeat them if they actually make it to the ballot. Shareholder resolutions and the reaction to them are a pretty good source of what a company actually cares about too. Like if you've got a company saying out of one side of their mouth, oh, we gave $25 million to charity that is meant to improve racial equity. On the other side of their mouth, they're fighting a shareholder resolution. I'm thinking of a specific bank here, fighting a shareholder resolution that would require them to disclose, what they've actually done to improve racial equity. I think that that's an indicator that they may not be so serious about it. Something Heather mentioned in her intro as well that I think is another red flag is looking at companies with green bonds and sustainability linked loans and sustainable financing. We get a lot of announcements. Oh, we just did a $600 million green bond, and aren't we so great? you really got to read the bond covenants. You really got to look at what those are actually doing, because a lot of those they're just nonsense, or on the other side, you've got these new things like sustainability linked loans, sustainability linked products, where, the way it works, right, is, so if you borrow this money and you improve on whatever ESG metrics you've agreed you'll improve on, the bank will give you a better rate. But you can't just take those at face value. You've got to look and try to get the information about what the rate change will be and what the KPIs you have to hit are to get that rate change, because most of the time it's completely negligible. Oftentimes the bonds are callable before the rate change would kick in, and there's just all sorts of escape clauses and stuff that can undermine what they're meant to do.
Can everyone share if they have specific tips to come to mind? I don't know how experienced everyone who's listening is, or if there are any people who are new to reporting or this topic. Things like where you're talking about looking at what companies are lobbying for, like how do you just give some specific sort of nitty-gritty steps for where you go or how you do some of these things that you're talking about?
Well, a couple things from me. When it comes to the lobbying activity, I think maybe if it might not necessarily be what they're doing specifically. Say you can't get that data, but what industry groups do they belong to, and what do those industry groups stand for? And if they're lobbying against something that the company should be doing, then what does that say about the commitment? So that would be one thing. That should be pretty easy to get, the industry association thing. I also, to the point that was just being made about the loans, there are a number of ratings organizations that are starting to keep tabs on companies that might be useful. This one that often comes up in the sustainability linked loan things, with a credit facility that's linked to sustainability or ESG, is Sustainalytics. They're a good organization to look at. Maybe S&P True Cost has a lot of good data on this. There's some organizations like EcoVadis and Data Marin that are starting to develop like ratings and information about companies. It's a third party, so that could be helpful as far as what you are trying to learn about. I think I got off your original question, but sorry about that.
No,
I would add that I have found over the years that activists who are trying to pressure organizations actually are a pretty good source. We're doing a story right now on the American Petroleum Institute, which of course lobbies for big oil. Activists have been very good at pointing out the discrepancy between what big oil says it's doing and where they're putting their money. And that's putting a lot of pressure both on the lobbying group and on, of course, big oil to not fund them as much. Mm-hmm. So they won't catch everything. Obviously, they focus on big targets, but they can be a good source of information as well because they watch it closely.
Ceres is probably the one that you want to watch very closely. CERES. If you don't have them bookmarked, you should.
I would say also Share Action is really good. As You Sow, they focus on a lot of shareholder resolutions and pushing on this stuff. And yeah, as Leslie was referencing, like something like API, when they come out in favor of a carbon tax, as they did like 2 days ago, like what's really going on there? The activists will have their finger on that and be able to tell you what's going on behind the story pretty well. Because I mean, I wouldn't take it at face value.
I would add to that too. Yeah, a lot of those, especially the shareholders that are talking about this with companies, there's nothing, stopping them from telling you what the company said to them, which, you have to verify, you have to look into a lot more, but especially for even just getting a sense of where to look or what to look for. And also, a couple of companies have put out climate lobbying reports after investor demands. And those can be tough to find. They're buried on, their websites somewhere generally, and they're very specific, which is both what investors wanted, but makes it, they're like in a very specific place. But I know, for example, ConocoPhillips put out something, and there was sort of an investor reaction of they thought that they were actually, in their view, doing a little better on climate risk than that then indicated to them, seeing that they essentially said with a lot of these groups, and API being one of them, they're aligned with what we want to do on climate, with the policy we want. So we're starting to see a little more of that disclosure, and that's very informative as well.
Since activists came up for just a minute there, I want to go back to the concept of greenwashing, but from the other end. How do you figure out, which are there specific organizations? I mean, it sounds like there are specific organizations that you sort of look to and find most reliable, but what role do they play for you in your reporting? Do they become sources of story ideas, or just sources, when you're sort of gut checking something, and how do you know who to, what to believe and what not to?
I can start on that. I mean, I think that a lot of them they're by and large really good. I haven't had too many negative experiences. Some of them, I think, oversell their point of view sometimes. Some of them may not have the best understanding of how finance works. A lot of the stuff I see around index funds and stuff like that, there seems to be a bit of a misunderstanding sometimes about what an index fund is and how it works and what is possible within the context of how those are run. But when it comes to, like Laura said, a lot of these activist groups are working directly with large shareholders in these companies that have a direct line to management, and they can talk to you about what the company is saying behind closed doors when they push them on whatever issue it may be, whether it's environmental, social, or governance.
I would just make a point that there's a difference between activists and shareholder activists, if that's not obvious to everyone. Like, there are environmental activists, but there are also those that specifically hold shares of companies, even if they're very small amounts, to pressure them. And those people have a very different function, and they tend to be much more plugged in. And that's not to say they don't have their own agenda, and you shouldn't take that also with skepticism, but they are a more reliable, they just watch this stuff a lot more closely than a general environmental group, which of course is just a direct advocacy and might serve a different function.
That's a very, very important distinction. Thank you for, I was talking about the latter, the shareholder activist types. That's a really, really important distinction to make.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm actually thinking specifically, like, as if you want a specific example, Green Century they're not really shareholder, they're more of a fund, right? But some of the stories that I've done on deforestation in the recent past have been because I've seen what they're pushing for the companies that they're holding positions in. And they've been very active, specifically on deforestation, with a lot of different companies. And I've gotten some good data out of them.
This actually just reminds me, I'm just going to play off of that. And so another source of what other ESG funds or companies might be doing are people who manage ESG funds. Often they don't like other people having the label ESG if they don't think that they've actually honestly earned it. And not for the record, but for your information only, they will point out that someone else is doing something else. And they'll say, we would never own that company because this, and that I find has been a very fruitful avenue. And again, they're investors, they've got the ESG label, they're really paying attention, so they often know where the bodies are buried.
They can be very helpful on the debt side as well, where it's like, you should take a look at this bond because those terms are insane.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. I have a few more questions, but let's get to some audience questions and then we'll come back. So let's see. Have you been able to get senior level executives to talk to you? Do you have any tips for getting inside the company? Anyone want to take that?
I'm happy to try it. I think that I don't have trouble getting senior level people, but I think it's harder if you're freelance, and I don't know who you're associated with. Some of this has nothing to do with you. It has to do with the organization you're with and whether they see a plus or minus in talking to you. Sometimes if you're very small or independent, they have less reason to be concerned. And so that isn't always within your control. Of course, if you have a piece of knowledge that makes it that could be scary to them, that gives them a lot more need to talk to you.
That was what I was just going to say, is I think the best, I don't usually have trouble, but I have even less trouble when I have a specific thesis that I'm exploring and information that I need to vet with them, and I've come to them specifically for that information, and I can be very detailed about what I'm looking for.
I can fully endorse what Leslie said. I mean, it's not fair necessarily, but the organization that you're with has such a huge impact on who's going to talk to you. I've seen it in my career as I've moved from very, very, very small niche B2B publications up to where I am now. And it's just like, wow, this is so much easier. And it has nothing to do with me. It's purely the name of the organization. So no, I don't think we have the problem of getting senior level executives to talk to us. I think we have the problem of getting senior level executives to tell us anything useful sometimes. They all want to, trot out there and talk up like how great they're doing on ESG, and getting them to get off of the recorded message, because by the time they've got all this media training, they're like a robot. You just press the button and they do their spiel. Getting them to get off message and actually give you something useful that's where your reporting skills come in handy. But yeah, if you're freelance, if you're working for a smaller organization, just keep plugging away. I've been there. I feel you.
On that note, I mean, do you go to people lower in the organization because they might be a little more, willing to speak freely, even if they don't have the weight of the title in the story?
Yeah. I mean, I think it depends on the company. It depends on the person, right? I mean, and depends on your relationship with them, which is obviously very hard during the pandemic to make new sources. Like you can't go get coffee with someone, and that makes life so much harder when you're trying to break into a new company or into a new beat or develop new sources. But yeah, the lower level people certainly are much more willing, especially I find them much more willing to talk to you frankly off the record as well, to really help you out with getting the truth. The higher up you go, just my experience, the more you have to worry about them just spinning it. And I don't know. Yeah, I think it works better. But yeah, right now under the pandemic, it's tough to develop new sources.
Okay, let's go to another question. Can you talk about covering the investment side? What to look for in state government investment? Sorry, I'm not wearing my glasses. State government investment or retirement funds that might be making ESG decisions. To look for in.
I can take that again. Sorry, I've been talking a lot, but I covered institutional investment for like 10 years before I moved to this beat. So I've covered pensions and endowments and foundations. And yeah, I mean, I think that when you're looking at like investment retirement funds, it's important like to get beyond, again, it's the same advice over and over and over again, but get beyond the headline of what they're trying to spin to you and look at what they're doing across their entire portfolio. So a lot of, the funds that are doing divestment and stuff like that, you've really got to, I don't know, it's tough to get them to, it depends. Okay. So it depends on what kind of institutional investor you're talking about, right? If it's a public pension and they're, subject to FOIA laws, then you can really get in there and get some better information. But if you're talking to a university endowment, or you're talking to a foundation that doesn't by law have to give you anything, they might not even tell you who their investment managers are. They might not tell you what their asset allocation is. And getting that information can be tough, but it's doable. But I think you've really got to look at sort of the totality of what their programs are. If it's just we're sectioning off 1% of our portfolio to this impact fund, is that as useful as actually implementing a full ESG green strategy across everything and looking at it? And there's the risk too, right? It's not just about impact. It's about like integrating ESG risk and looking at what could happen to your portfolio if you're not paying attention to the social or environmental risks that the companies in your portfolio are facing. And getting them to talk about it like that, I think is always useful. But yeah, hope that's helpful.
The other thing I'll add is that I think this particular category has been very, very much the driver of a lot of the stuff that's happening right now. They have been demanding, some certain funds have been demanding more attention to this. They've been trying to distinguish themselves by saying they're gonna dump this, they're going to invest in that. So like it's a pretty powerful voice right now in this discussion. So I don't have better detailed than what Billy was just offering, but it is an influential stakeholder.
Yeah, and when they're talking about engagement, I think that's where it gets really important to vet what they're saying, right? Like you've got two ways of doing ESG, right? Engagement or divestment, where you either cut out the holdings that you disagree with, or you try to make the companies change. And the way that most large investors are going typically is the engagement route. So, Heather mentioned Ceres earlier. They back a group called the Climate Action 100 Plus. But when you are talking to someone, they're like, oh, we joined the Climate Action 100 Plus, or we joined this group, or we joined that group. Find out what they're actually doing, because a lot of times it doesn't mean anything to join those groups. You just sign your name to a piece of paper, check the box. The UNPRI is another one. What are you actually doing as a member of that group? It doesn't require you to vote in any way, shape, or form. It doesn't require you to do much. So just ask questions and don't just take them at their word. Reporting 101 again.
Yeah.
That's a really great point on the discussion, especially around engagement and divestment. And I think one of the things there is with the big asset managers, especially, we've seen BlackRock make a lot of statements about climate change in the past couple of years. And those statements in themselves, that is something. But the big thing, especially for both environmental activists and shareholder activists, pressuring them is their proxy voting does not line up with that. And that being said, their argument is that, it's because of those private talks with corporate leaders that they're making their case, then they don't do it through voting. That seems like it may be shifting, BlackRock has said, and we'll see. But I think looking at some of those voting records can be really informative, especially if, especially like with the big asset managers, they're largely not going to say what they were told in an engagement. And so there's just, only so much you can rely on that for. And I think as well, this is with another thing with covering the investment side is what's going on with the Labor Department and some regulations under the Trump administration sort of at the last minute that were viewed as sort of like anti-ESG investment. And Biden has, prioritized reversing one. Marty Walsh has said he'll prioritize reversing both or reissuing both. So I think
Laura, can you, for people who might not be following, can you just sort of brief us on what you're talking about there with the Labor Department?
Yeah, sure. So there were two rules, and one essentially warned against ESG investment in retirement, employer-sponsored retirement funds, so 401ks, private pensions, and it was lightened a bit before the Trump administration finalized it, but it's still essentially you need to only look at pecuniary factors when you're choosing funds to include in retirement plans, if you're a fiduciary of those plans. And it's clear that pecuniary is not in that case meant to mean ESG. And then the second was on proxy voting and restricting when fiduciaries of those funds can cast proxy votes. So proxy voting is a huge space for ESG pressure. It's a huge way that a lot of things move and get done and become on a company's agenda. So there were also rules at the SEC on proxy voting and shareholder proposals that were also seen as making those ESG activism more difficult. But those DOL proposals, it looks like, will be a priority to change course on that. And there's also some Democrats, and we'll see, who would like to see sustainable investment options in federal workers' retirement plans. So I think we'll kind of see how much the Biden administration wants to move on things like that.
Can we talk? Sorry, Leslie, I want to stay on this topic. But let me just add a question to it, and then you can take it away. But just if we could talk about just differences in this administration compared to last. What are the big things to know that have changed or that you see changing?
Well, I mean, obviously that's night and day. I just wanted to make a quick point on the other, which is there are different ways that investors, and I don't know if we made that clear, there's engagement and there's divestment, and they're two very different roles. And some retirement plans simply have been told they have to divest out of certain things like tobacco. others engage, and there's still a very healthy debate about which is the better way to get people to change their behavior. As for the two administrations, obviously it's just a night and day issue, but I think that for journalists who cover this, and I think if we're all honest about the fact that we probably, if you cover it, you probably do care about climate change, you have to be careful not to cheerlead too much for one side. I think all of us going into this, it is a relief, I think, to see people taking climate change seriously and not eliminating it off of all government websites. But I think we also have to figure out what concrete is happening, what concrete is not happening. They've promised, Gina McCarthy has promised some very concrete metrics coming up. I think we will be responsible for holding them responsible. Now that's a little different from ESG, but it all plays in together.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the DOL stuff is going to be really important to watch. It seems like there are some pretty easy ways they can expand the definition of pecuniary to include ESG, but as it stands right now, they're pretty much just daring any employer to add an ESG option to a 401k. It hasn't really been tested in court whether or not they are banned or not. So that's going to be something really interesting to watch. Whatever Gensler, assuming he gets confirmed, does at the SEC is going to be important as well. He hasn't really talked much about ESG. That doesn't seem to be super high on his radar, but I do think we can expect a change in tone there from what we saw under Clayton. But then watching what Brian Dees does at the National Economic Council is going to be really important too, because he was the head of sustainable investing at BlackRock. And like Leslie said, yeah, I mean, we all believe in science and are, passionate about climate change, I'm sure, else we wouldn't be doing these jobs. But it is really important not to get kind of swept up in the fervor of, oh my God, they're actually, taking this stuff seriously, and make sure that what they're doing is, worthwhile, and that we report it fair.
I think on that note, within what happens, there will need to be, and I'm sure will be, a lot of scrutiny. For example, the SEC is expected to do ESG disclosure in some form. What ends up in, qualifying as ESG, what ends up included, whether it's done in one package or separately, whether it's done to conform to third-party standard setters, guidelines, and whether it is done in a way that is in concert with sort of global regulators. There's so many questions within that. And there are so many different ways that seem small in which it could go, but that would, trickle into hugely different outcomes. And I think that's also where, as reporters, it's both that it in itself is a story, but then, also if there is more data available, I think across business beats, the ESG data is, also a source in itself of important stories from that direction as well.
Just one thing to add to this is that it's important to remember that right now these disclosures are voluntary in the United States. And that's what you were just referencing, Laura. Whereas in other jurisdictions, that is becoming, they're talking about making them voluntary, right? So in Europe, there's push for that. I forget, it's like Hong Kong might already have. There's different places that have voluntary. New Zealand. And so as far as differences in administration, I do see, I have heard talk of voluntary reporting requirements, to your point, Laura, coming down from this new administration, and which would really change things a great deal. Now I have no idea.
It's important to watch what's happening in Europe too, because even if this administration doesn't make TCFD or whatever other ESG disclosures mandatory, when that's happening in the UK, which is on the docket in the UK, when it's happening in New Zealand, and then you look at legislation or regulation coming out of the UK like SFDR, which we won't get into now because it's really boring and complicated, but it's going to have a big impact on any companies that are working across, jurisdictions. It's going to be similar to something like GDPR, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, or MiFID II, which is, another financial regulation that had a big impact on the investment industry. So whether or not this administration takes it up, change is coming, and it's going to be very, a lot's going to happen.
This audience question let's get to it. It seems every time the finance industry celebrates a new investment product like green bonds, they turn out 5, 10, 20 years later to implode. Do you see any early concerns with green bonds?
I think less with green bonds than with sustainability bonds. Green bonds have a more specific requirement around them than the sustainability ones do. The sustainability ones seem to be more like wishy-washy. And there's a difference between the sustainability bond and the green bond and the sustainability linked loans that we're talking about. But I don't know. I would say watch for that one if someone's using language about a bond that's described like that, not green.
I can add to that. I'm not super concerned about green bonds imploding. I think green bonds, there have been examples where the Mexico City airport is the one that comes to mind, where Mexico City issued a green bond to fund building a new airport, which I don't know how that's green to begin with, but it got bought, and then AMLO came into office and canceled the project altogether. And so now everybody who bought that bond it's just been the money's just been turned over to the general coffers. There's no recourse. There's nothing like that. But it didn't blow up. I worry more, and I wrote about the potential for a green bubble not too long ago in the FT. I worry more about the flow of money into ESG funds that is pushing a lot of investment in companies that you might not want to put that much money into, that are valuations getting out of hand. Just because if investors have recognized ESG as an investment opportunity, in addition to an opportunity to kind of display your values, there's not that many true ESG companies out there to absorb all this money, and it's pushing some valuations up pretty high that I worry about seeing that come crashing down. I've got my eye on that more than green bonds. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think there's something there.
Interesting. Okay. Just to follow up on just one more sort of topic specific question before we start to wrap up. Just since net zero pledges are sort of the word of the day, it seems like, was it just Citigroup yesterday, I think, had a new commitment. So, I mean, we've talked about it a little bit, but is there anything to add, about how, what trends you're seeing, either in terms of things to be skeptical about, or signs that they're more credible than you might have expected, or any, are there things that you look for just when you're reporting on these, or do you just stop reporting on them because they don't matter anymore?
Well, they're pretty crazy, but I would say that they're coming fast and furious now. I can't tell you though how many times I get a net zero pledge where there are no details attached. Those are coming. I don't cover those. I won't even look at them. I don't want to discuss them. Now, of course, with some of the places like Citigroup, they probably get covered anyway, but there would definitely be a paragraph in there that said, but let's just be clear, they've told us absolutely nothing. And I do think that that's a very important part. And then we talked about the other pieces, which are the concrete steps, the money along the way, how are we going to hold them accountable, and those things that are going on. But there's certainly all the rage. And that doesn't mean that we don't seriously hope that people are going to net zero by 2050. It's just approach with deep caution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And look for the real zero activities, to your point, Leslie, what are they actually doing to change their business practices, to possibly invest in actual carbon removal technologies? What are they actually doing beyond offsets?
Yeah. Citigroup, the announcement said check back in later this year for more details. It was thin even by these standards, and like Leslie said, I think that we've hit a saturation point. It's not news that a company has pledged to go net zero. When we covered this actually in this morning's newsletter, I think there's a lot of frustration. There's a lot of people getting fed up with the concept of net zero. Heather mentioned real zero, which is a concept that we talked about with a report from Friends of the Earth International. explaining kind of the problem with net zero. And I think that we're moving beyond that from what I can tell, if I'm reading the tea leaves correctly.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'll move to just a wrap-up question because we're almost out of time, but I do just want to add my 2 cents since we talked about the tree planting before, and I wanted to follow up, but we moved on. But getting back to like the real zero versus, I mean, just as there are all of these tree planting efforts, and we've talked about how it's not an answer, and it doesn't mean it's not the same as not cutting down trees, but another thing to sort of dig deeper on is what trees are being planted and how, because this is a story I've written, for a few science publications, just that there's a lot of like, we're going to plant 1 million trees and then 1 million trees get planted but don't survive, and it's a waste of money, and it ruins it can damage local ecosystems and harm local communities, and there's a whole bunch of stuff. So I just wanted to plug the trees for a minute there. So let's wrap up with just a question about the year ahead. What do you expect to see or predict for better or worse for the coming year? Let's go backwards. So Billy, let's start with you.
I think all eyes are on COP26, which is the big UN climate conference scheduled for Glasgow for the end of the year. Countries are making, their nationally determined contributions and trying to ramp up their ambition. So I think that as we roll up to COP, it's going to be really interesting to kind of follow what the participants are doing. The UK is really, mandatory TCFD disclosure, which we mentioned earlier, is kind of part of what they're doing. Boris Johnson making all these pledges to support electric vehicles. Other countries are going to be making similar types of commitments as we get closer toward COP. And there's a lot riding on this COP. The last one kind of ended in a failure with, a failure to kind of do universal carbon pricing. And it's going to be pretty important. So I think that's kind of the key issue I'm looking for the rest of the year.
And Laura?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. I think on the sort of legislative and regulatory front, seeing what the SEC does will be interesting, whether the agency moves on ESG disclosures, which ones or if all together are priorities, and then as well seeing what happens in Congress, because ESG has sort of increasingly been coming up in legislation. There are sort of constantly now new bills from different lawmakers that are addressing ESG in some way or would add ESG disclosures in some way, but not much of that has moved far at all. So seeing, where that goes. And then I think I spend a lot of time focusing on shareholder proposals and that sort of activism and that pressure. And I think both racial justice will be a huge focus there in some interesting and new ways, and climate change as well in different ways, things like financing of banks and climate related lobbying, sort of moving past, as was said, like just a net zero commitment. So I think that'll be big to watch too.
Mm-hmm.
Heather.
So I mentioned one in the beginning, this loans thing, with the money that's related to ESG issues that forces the C-suite to really focus on whether those terms are being met, because they're going to get credit for cheaper if they do. I do think that's going to be a huge, like, just to the point about before, I'm seeing at least a couple of those a day now. It's just this $10 billion one from Anheuser-Busch, this, and they're getting quite substantial. So is it hype? Yeah, probably, but it's going to be a big year for that. The other thing I think is an important story, especially for my audience, is this standardized reporting, right? Because there's so many different reporting frameworks of the Global Reporting Initiative. There's a task force, for climate-related financial disclosures. There's so many different frameworks. The Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, the World Economic Forum is really trying to push for just sort of a more cohesive framework that is not country specific, that you could report in, and that's been one of the big bugaboos for many of the companies. Is there are too many different ways to declare these things, too many different surveys they have to answer, too many data gathering exercises, And I think that the standardization of that is going to be an important story, not just this year, but for a couple next few years.
I hope so. I am so tired of writing about it. If they could just sort it out.
Yeah, same here.
Great. Okay. Well, we're just about out of time, and I want to hear from Leslie. So
we are out of time. I would just, standardization would be great. We'll be focusing on, we talked about a lot about the E in ESG, but we are going to be, I do think there's a lot of racial justice, and there will be a lot of intersection in the upcoming year between the E in ESG and the racial justice stuff. So we're going to be looking at that. We'll keep a great eye on offsets as usual. We think there's a lot to uncover in that area. And finally, for us, the Biden administration, the biggest changes and their goals. Will there be a carbon tax? What will come out of the stimulus? All of those are writ large beyond ESG, but obviously have huge impacts.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks everyone. This was a really great conversation. It was nice to hear from you all.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for asking good questions.
Sincere thank you to Rachel and the panel. There's a lot of wealth of information. You all are very knowledgeable, obviously, on this topic. To our listeners, keep an eye out for SABU's next monthly training session. We'll be sharing more details about that soon. Finally, if you have any suggestions about future training topics, please email sabu@sabu.org. And with that, this concludes today's call. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you for including me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.